Katie. Welcome back to my channel, La Casa de Katie. If you missed it, I started my channel last week and my first video was a Q&A with facts about me. One of the facts that I shared is that I actually am an adoptive parent. So I have adopted my daughter with my husband Nick, and we actually finalized our adoption not too long ago, but we have been in the process for quite a while. So today I wanted to share our journey to adoption. I know that when I was looking into adoption for the first time, I loved to see videos and stories about what made people want to adopt, about what got them to that point. So I thought this would be a perfect video to make because I know it's something I would have really enjoyed watching. One of the reasons I wanted to make this video specifically is because we adopted from foster care, and I find that it is very difficult to find videos about adopting from foster care. There are a ton of videos about adopting internationally, even a lot about adopting an infant domestically, but there's not a lot about foster care adoption. Today I wanted to share a little bit about the process and why we chose to adopt from foster care. And there's actually two routes you can go with this. The first route is that you actually become a foster parent and you just take in any kids that need a home. The goal of foster care is to reunite children with their birth families. However, this is not always possible. Sometimes the birth parents are not able to meet the requirements to gain custody of their children again, and so that is where adoption from foster care comes into play. So oftentimes families will just, like I said, they will foster a child. That child's case will become available for adoption. So in this situation, you usually are with this child for at least a year, oftentimes more, before you are adopting them. And it's probably felt like they're a part of your family for a long time, but it's just all becoming official now. In our case, we actually chose a different route of adopting from foster care. In our route, you are licensed foster parents, but you do not foster a child. You are taking in a child who is already available to be adopted, and the plan is that after 6 months you will be able to finalize their adoption. Their parental rights have already been revoked for one reason or another, unfortunately, but this child is available to be adopted. However, their foster family is either not able or not willing to adopt the child. So this is a huge need. There are a lot of kids in this situation in foster care, and it's just not as known. You can do this through the county or through an agency, this type of adoption. We went through an agency, which I'll explain. But before I jump into all of that, I just want to go through kind of what made us want to adopt. So my husband and I started dating in college. So it was about 2010 when we started dating. We were 19 years old. So although we talked about the future, and I think we both kind of knew we may eventually marry each other someday, we did talk about the future, but kids felt really far into the future, so we didn't feel quite ready to talk about that all the time. All we knew is that we both wanted kids at some point in our lives. That was about it. So it wasn't until later in our marriage that we really started talking about adoption. The first time that I thought about adoption was when I was a kid. I mean, I always kind of thought that adoption might be something I would pursue in the future, but it was always kind of an idea and never really a reality because I was so young, I was so far away from it. It wasn't until about 1.5 years into our marriage that I truly started thinking, wow, I think we are supposed to adopt a kid. Which is kind of funny because when we first got married, we talked about kids, and I was definitely more like, yeah, I think I want to wait like 5 years before we have kids. Like, I'm just not really ready for that yet. And my husband was more like, oh no, we could have kids sooner, like maybe 3 years or maybe 4 years. So it was kind of funny that 1.5 years into marriage, I started just thinking about adoption, and I can't really pinpoint a time that I thought about it. I don't know if I heard an adoptive story or if it just hit me one day, but I just had this feeling in my heart like this is something I'm supposed to do. And I really felt like God was telling me to do that. And I'm not really the type of person to say that very often because oftentimes I feel like people can use that as a way to justify a decision they're making. And instead of it really being something that they feel like God is telling them, it's more about making themselves feel better. So it's very rare that I would say that, but in that moment I really felt that way. I didn't bring this up to Nick initially because we were actually at the time, right after we got married, we were living overseas. So we were teachers and missionaries in the Dominican Republic. So we had signed a 3-year commitment, and we knew for the next 3 years we were going to be teaching and living on support that we had fundraised, and we just knew that kids were not really in the picture at that time. Now, obviously, if I had gotten pregnant, we would have been happy about it and we would have been excited about the next stage, but we just felt like at the time that wasn't something we were going to actively pursue, because we felt like God was calling us at that time to just really pour into our students and just be focused on the ministry we were doing. And we knew that if we had a kid, it would really kind of take away from that for us at that time. So we decided to wait on kids. And so when I first, had this thought 1.5 years into marriage, I didn't want to freak Nick out. I know he's not as much of a future person, and talking about the future way far in advance kind of stresses him out. And so since I knew that we were so far down the road from that, I didn't want to get into it yet, especially because I hadn't really prayed about it or tested the idea on my own, and so I wanted to do that first before I brought that up to him. At that time, I just started reading. I was reading everything I could about adoption. I was reading books, I was reading blogs, I was reading stories from adoptive parents, I was reading stories from adoptees who were adults and their experience. I was reading about all the different kinds of adoption. I was just trying to get my hands on anything and everything I could. I'm definitely a researcher and a planner. So for me, if I'm thinking of doing something, it really helps me to have a lot of time to think and prepare and read up about it so that I can make sure it's a decision I want to make. I definitely did that with adoption. I'll be the first to admit, I over-researched, and sometimes that, doesn't help me that much when we're actually going through the process with our daughter, because I think about, well, this source said to do this and this source said to do that, and that can just kind of make you go crazy. But I am glad that I researched, because I wanted to read about every story of adoption to make sure and to test that it was something I truly was feeling called to do. And obviously at the same time, I was praying through this and asking God, is this what we're supposed to do? Will you show us this path? And when I first started researching, I really got attached to the idea of adopting internationally. Obviously, I was living internationally at the time, and Nick and I both had talked about in the future raising our children to be bilingual. We learned Spanish while we were living in the Dominican, and my husband actually grew up in Brazil as a missionary kid, so he speaks fluent Portuguese. So we knew that in one way or another, one language or another, we wanted to have our children be able to be bilingual. So speaking Spanish or Portuguese in our household was definitely going to happen at some point. And so I thought, why not adopt internationally? Because if we already want to have a bilingual household, how great would that be for a kid coming into our home who already speaks another language and is looking to be able to maintain that after their adoption? And so I really felt like we could offer some things that other families adopting from the States would not be able to do. So I started looking into adopting from South American countries, and I was just researching because obviously I hadn't talked to Nick really about this. I mean, he knew I was looking at stuff about adoption, but I didn't really bring it up very much until later that next summer. So at our 2-year anniversary, we took a little trip, and I just knew that that trip was going to be the time that I needed to sit down with Nick and talk to him and make sure that we were on the same page when it came to adoption. Because we had never, that I remember at least in our relationship, we had never talked about adoption. And so I really didn't know what he was going to say. Although I will say I was fairly confident that he was going to be okay with adopting at least one child. I don't know. I just had this feeling that that was something he would be open to. But the problem is throughout this whole process of thinking about adoption and starting to imagine what that could look like in our lives, I had this feeling in my heart that maybe adoption was, first of all, what we were going to do first. And most people tend to have biological kids and then adopt. But I really felt this desire to make adoption my plan A, my first plan. And as I kind of thought through that idea, I really started to feel like maybe adoption was the only thing we were going to do. Maybe adoption was our plan A, our route that we were supposed to take for all of the children that we have. And I mean, at that time, that thought was a little scary because most people want to have biological kids. That's just a fact of life. Obviously, a lot of people come to adoption after going through, infertility and struggling with that, and maybe even trying IVF and things along those lines. But for me, I was going to be coming to Nick saying, I think we should adopt, and I think that maybe we should only adopt. We should just make that what we do for our family. And I was scared because I wasn't sure how he was going to respond to that. So when I brought it up to him, I just said, you know, I've been feeling this way. I've never felt this really strong desire to have biological children, but I wanted to have kids. So I don't know many women who have a desire to have kids but do not have a desire to have biological children. So I felt like that's kind of significant. I need to tell him. And so I sat down and I told him first about just adoption in general. And he really surprised me because he said, yeah, actually, I've kind of thought my whole life that I would adopt someday. And I was like, what? We've never talked about this before. And it's never come up that I remember. And he was like, yeah, I don't know. When I was just a kid, I thought, I'll probably adopt someday. Like, I think that'd be a really cool thing to do. And so it was just so surprising and great to hear that we were on the same page. But obviously, I still needed to tell him that I was possibly feeling called to only adopt children. And just to explain this part, I actually do have a medical issue that could make pregnancy difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. And I did know about that, and so did Nick at this time. But we would never let that stop us from having biological children if we felt that we had that desire or that we were being called to do that. That's why we never say never. You know, we're never going to just totally shut out that possibility, but for now, that's not where we are. So Nick actually was super receptive to that and said that he didn't really feel that it was important whether or not our kids were biological or adopted. He wanted to have a family, and he knew that adoption was something that he wanted to do at some point. And so we were on the same page. And I have to say, I probably asked him, are you sure, about 100 times, because I didn't want him to just be saying that to make me feel better or to go along with something I wanted. I wanted to make sure that, I don't know, I wasn't like depriving him of this opportunity to have biological kids. And you know, I won't pretend like there aren't times where I think, oh, that could be fun. You know, you see friends get pregnant, have babies, and there are things about it that seem nice, but I still just have not wavered in that call to adopt. And yeah, so that's kind of how we got started on the journey of adoption. So initially, we were really interested in international adoption. We started looking into it, and as you probably know, it's extremely expensive. But we really felt like, you know, we were missionaries and we raised our support, and we knew that if it was something we were supposed to do, God would come through, whether it be through a job or through donations, that if we were supposed to adopt internationally, God was capable of doing that. So originally, this was going into our last year in the Dominican. We were starting to look at where were we going to live after we moved back to the States. And when we were looking into it, Nick kind of found a job opportunity that seemed really promising. And if he got that job and I got a teaching job, we pretty much knew that we would be able to save up for an international adoption and be able to do that within a couple of years of moving back. And this job seemed really promising. Like, he was interviewed several times. Like, he had a lot of meetings with them, a lot of communication back and forth. And it wasn't until a couple weeks before we moved back in May of 2016 that this job got back to him and said, actually, we chose someone else. And so that was really hard, obviously, because we had kind of been hoping that that was going to work out. Like, I had already accepted a job nearby where this was going on, and that just wasn't there. But the hardest part was I felt like these dreams of being able to adopt internationally were just kind of just shattered on the floor. Like, and obviously Nick was struggling with the fact that this job seemed like a possibility and then it wasn't. And then at the same time, I was feeling disappointed because now I had no clue how we were going to adopt internationally without fundraising, like everything. And that was very difficult. So that was something that we just really had to go through. That first year that we were back in the States, I was teaching and Nick was picking up little jobs here and there. He was a substitute teacher. He was also doing some freelance writing, and we just didn't have a ton of money. The other thing was we had planned to go on a big trip we had been saving up for like 3 years, and we just knew this was a trip we wanted to take, especially before we had kids. And so we had that trip all booked for the next summer. And so we just said, you know, we can't focus on adoption this year. It's just not going to be possible. So that was hard. But I will say, I think it was a blessing, because the first year back in the States was a lot of adjusting. Even though this is a country I've lived in my entire life, other than those 3 years, moving back was hard. Like moving back and adjusting to the culture again and all the way things work here, all the paperwork you have to do that you don't have to do there. It was difficult. So I think it was a blessing that didn't work out. I believe it was the summer of 2017. Someone came to our church to talk about statistics from where we live. So we live in Ohio, and they were talking about just all the statistics of homelessness and poverty and drug addiction, and also the needs for foster care. Obviously, a lot of those things go hand in hand. And so they were talking about all the need for foster families in our area, and just how there were kids who were not even being able to have somewhere to sleep when they were being removed from their homes. They would have to sleep at like social workers' offices because they did not have enough beds. We just felt really convicted, like, you know, here we are dreaming about international adoption, hoping that can happen, wishing we had the money to do it, when there are these kids in foster care who need homes right now. It's free to do foster care, and you actually get some financial assistance from the state in order to care for that child. Not much, but some. That was the first time we really started talking about maybe international adoption is not what we're supposed to do. And that was hard, because I had spent a lot of time just imagining what it would be like to adopt internationally and to have that experience. But then I realized that's not what it's about. Like, it's really about family, and it's about putting kids in families who need them. That was the time where I just realized I needed to let go of that dream of international adoption and be open to what God had for us. And we really both felt like we were supposed to do foster care in some way. We started attending classes. We didn't attend classes right away. We had a situation where we had a friend living with us who was transitioning to living here, and we just knew that we needed to wait until he was ready to move out to start the home study process. So in the winter of that following year, we actually started attending classes. Our plan originally was that we were going to just be foster parents, and we were not necessarily even going into it with the idea that it could turn into adoption. We wanted to go into it thinking, let's be a safe family for some kids who need it, and let's see what happens. We honestly at that point thought that maybe there was a possibility we would still adopt internationally, but for now we were being called to foster. So we went ahead and started taking some classes, and we went to an agency that pretty much only did foster care, not necessarily the adoption side of it. And the class was really good. Like, it was an orientation class, and there were definitely parts of it that were meant to kind of scare you off from doing adoption and doing foster care. But we really left that feeling like this is what we're supposed to do. And long story short, we ended up switching over to a different agency because we decided that although we do know that there need to be just good foster families who are willing to take kids in for a little while, we don't feel called to that at this point in our lives. The thing is that most people who do foster care that we know, because there's actually quite a few people in our church who have done this, either have biological kids already or they've already adopted children. So if they have a foster child in their home and that foster child ends up going back to their mom and dad, those parents will still be parents. They still have a kid already. As for us, if we were fostering and we had to say goodbye to these kids, we would no longer be parents. Like, we wouldn't have any other kids, and all of a sudden we'd go to being childless again, which I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I know a lot of families who can handle that, but I had this desire to be a parent so strongly that I just wasn't sure that it would be a good situation for the kids in our care for me to be on that emotional roller coaster of being a parent and not being a parent and all of that. So we just thought, you know, we feel ready to have a child in our home permanently. Let's adopt, and then we can do foster care in the future. And so we switched to an agency that is a part of a larger organization that does foster care, but this specific agency was their adoption agency. So what we did, like I said earlier in the video, is we adopted from foster care. So even though we are licensed foster parents, when we brought our daughter into our home, she was available for adoption already. So we had to complete a 6-month fostering period, and then we could finalize after that. So that's kind of how that process works. So it's a little different. When she came into our home, sure, there was a possibility it could not work out, but pretty much unless something crazy happened, she was going to be our daughter. We were going to adopt her. So there was a lot more certainty there and a lot less likely of a situation for you to end up not being able to adopt that child. So once we decided to adopt from foster care, we began this process of taking all of our classes, getting licensed, doing our home study, this whole long process. So I think we started that in about, I want to say February or March of 2018. So once we officially had our license, they started sending us different profiles on children to which we were supposed to say yes or no to. And we were sent one almost immediately, like days after we were approved, and it was like a 90-something page file on this little boy, and it was like every doctor's appointment he had ever had, every counseling appointment he had ever had, all the different things from his different foster homes he had been in, and it was so overwhelming. It was so heartbreaking to read everything that he had gone through. It was so confusing to know like what to pay attention to and what not to pay attention to. And at the time I thought, are all the files like this? But we ended up saying that we were interested, and the way that the people made it sound was that we were going to be chosen, like that they hadn't chosen that many families and that they were really interested in us. But we did want to ask a few questions before we officially said, yes, we'd like to go through with this. So we actually went and we called the social workers, we emailed, and at first they were emailing back and we said, okay, yes, we're interested. And we thought that we were going to be chosen. And then couple weeks went by, we didn't get a response, we weren't getting responses from the social workers, and that's when I just realized, okay, they must have already chosen a family for him. So that was really difficult to go through because it seemed like so promising right away, and then it was just like totally done. Throughout this process, you do kind of start to realize that yes, there are a lot of kids who need to be adopted from foster care, but it still takes a really long time. And sometimes when people hear how long it took and all the process we went through, they're like, well, there must be so many families who want to adopt that there's not enough kids. And it's like, no, that's not the case at all. The thing is that there's so much paperwork, and these social workers are so overworked and so inundated with file after file that they can't get back to everyone. You may send in your home study to be considered for a child and you may never hear back, and that's just really hard. It's kind of like a more emotional version of applying for jobs, because sometimes, you'll apply somewhere and they won't even get back to you. They don't even like respond, tell you yes or no, and that's kind of what happened. But obviously this isn't just a job. This is like possibly going to be our child, like our future child. And so a huge time of just going on the emotional roller coaster up and down and just always wondering what's going to happen with that. So that waiting period was really hard, and we ended up waiting a little longer. I think it was about October. We were actually chosen to be considered for a sibling group of 3 children. Now, I will say, when we started this process, like many people who started the adoption process, we were pretty limited on the types of children we were interested in adopting. So we said we're only going to adopt a kid between the age of 0 and 5, and we're only going to adopt 1 kid. And like most people, throughout the process, we expanded the types of children that we were interested in adopting and able to adopt. So we were actually approved to adopt 6 children, which still blows my mind. I do not know how we could care for 6 children. So we said we were interested in adopting anywhere up to the age of 9 and up to 3 kids. So at this time, we actually were chosen to be considered for a sibling group of 3 kids, ages I think 9, 6, and 3. And our family definitely thought we were a little crazy, and our friends. Thankfully, not many of them told us that we thought we were crazy, because I think we needed to work through that on our own. But eventually we did come to the day where they were supposed to decide which family would be chosen, and we were not chosen. And I think it was to the relief of a lot of people in our family, because we had expanded our reach probably more than a lot of them were comfortable with, but we just felt like we needed to say yes to more. At that time when we found out that we were not chosen for those kids, it was sad because you do start to imagine your life with these different kids. You kind of have to, like, to mentally prepare yourself in case it happens. But at the same time, we both knew it was a little bit of a reach to say that we were going to be able to all of a sudden take on 3 kids, especially when one's older and most of our friends our age either don't have kids or have young kids. And so I think it was really for the best, and those children were matched with an amazing family, and I think that they're going to be totally happy and cared for. So I didn't worry at all about that situation, but it was a little bit of a letdown. We were a little sad because there was a part of us that was hoping to potentially have children in our home by Christmas, because it's just something about experiencing that first Christmas together. Looking back now, I realize that was a little foolish, because Christmas is, if you've adopted, you know this, can be a very difficult time for adopted kids, because it has all these memories of their birth families, or it has like a lot of trauma can happen around that time of year. And so I think it was a blessing that that didn't work out for us. During the time of Thanksgiving and Christmas, everything just slowed down. Like, we heard almost nothing. No social workers were really getting back to us, other than our social workers were, because they're awesome, like way faster than I expected or anticipated. But the other social workers for the children, it just, you didn't hear back much during the holidays, which makes sense. So everything slowed down during Thanksgiving and Christmas, and it was, I started to get a little discouraged, like, oh, we're coming up on a year from the time we even like started this process, and like, when is this gonna happen? And I was getting a little impatient and, just not trusting God like I should. And it was around January when I got an email from our social worker, and she said, there's a little girl, I need to know if you're interested in adopting her, and I need to know ASAP. And I was like, oh, okay. And all she had told me was that she was 18 months old, girl, seemed healthy. And I was like, okay, yeah, we're interested, but do you have any more information? So she sent me like a 1-pager, and it was basically like her birthday, how much she weighed when she was born, that she liked to dance, and that she liked cinnamon raisin bread. And that was all we knew. And we're like, yes, well, we're interested, I guess. Like, we had said yes to so many other cases, but it was really hard not to start to get really excited, because obviously adopting a little kid would be awesome. It wasn't something we felt like we had to do, but we're young and it's our first kid, so there were things about that would be good. And so we said yes, and she's like, okay, I'll let you know. Well, a few weeks later, we heard back, a couple weeks of like waiting and wondering, and wondering, should I start to imagine this? Should I start to picture it? They told me that we had been narrowed down, I think from like 12 families to 5. So we had made that cut down to 5 families. Now, like I said earlier, that makes it sound like there are not many kids to be adopted and a whole bunch of families who want to adopt. That's not the case, but it is definitely true that a lot of families are looking to adopt young kids. What was weird is that we were open to adopting up to 3 kids up to the age of 9. And so I was kind of surprised that they chose us for this, because I thought, oh, they probably want to save us for a case that might be a little harder to place. But we did make it to that cut. We knew that it was going to be still like several weeks until they had the meeting. So for several weeks I waited, and this is only the second time we had gone to a selection process. This time and the time with the 3 kids before. And so it was definitely nerve-wracking waiting. And I thought that the meeting was going to be in the morning on the day it was scheduled. And so I was kind of like, wonder when we're going to hear back. And then my social worker told me, oh, well, the meeting's not until like 3. And I was like, oh, okay. So I spent all day at work, like waiting. And then at the end of the day, the social worker called me, and I have horrible reception in my classroom at school. And I could barely hear, and I answered, and I was just like, hello? And she's like, hello, you're going to be a mommy. And so I knew then that we had been chosen, and she had talked to Nick as well. And yeah, really we barely knew anything about Brielle at this time. We were so excited, but just like, how were we chosen? Like, she said there were a lot of really good families, but we ended up being chosen because we were willing to have one parent stay home with her, and they thought that was really important. So we ended up being chosen, and then we just had to wait. I think we had to wait almost a month before we had, no, that's not true. I think we had to wait a couple of weeks before we could actually go and hear more information. So we drove to the city where Brielle was from, and we learned about her situation, her health history, her family history, and that was when we would say our official yes, we would like to pursue adoption. We already knew when we walked in that we were going to say yes, but they have to do this really formal process and like record the whole thing and everything. So we went and did that. We said yes, and then we finally saw the picture of her for the first time, because I don't think I mentioned this, but we had no pictures of what she looked like. So she's so cute. We were so excited. And so we were like texting pictures to my family and just like so excited. But we did have to wait about another month before we could actually meet her. And we actually met her for the first time at her foster home, and her foster parents were really great and welcomed us in and just helped us to feel comfortable and get acquainted with her. And it was just such a great experience. And so after that, I'm not going to go into all the details of that story, but after she was matched with us, we did visitations. So we actually drove to the city where she was from every weekend for a month. And the first couple weekends we would just like hang out with her in her foster home, and then we would take her out for a little bit to do something, like do an activity somewhere. Then one of the following weekends we actually got to take her, and she stayed at a hotel with just us. So it was her first like overnight experience with us, which was hard for her, but was also for us exciting. Obviously it was difficult for her because she was confused. And then the following weekend, she actually came home with us to our house and got to spend the weekend with us, and then we drove her back at the end of the weekend. She actually did so well at our house. We were so surprised. We thought our dog would be overwhelming to her, but she loved her from the first moment, wanted to be with her the whole time. And she just seemed so at home in her room and all of this. So we were just really, really thankful for that. And then we took her back, and we knew that the next week we were going to get her and she was going to move in with us like forever. That was just really surreal to know that the next time we saw her, she was coming home with us, and that the day of picking her up was so emotional for us, for her foster parents, because they just loved her so much and still do. And then we started the 6-month period of fostering before we could finalize. I'm not going to pretend that those 6 months were a walk in the park. They were not. Like the first couple weeks were awesome. You know, I'm sure you've heard about like the honeymoon period of adoption. She was super good. She listened to everything. She never got into anything, like very abnormal toddler behavior. And then she got comfortable. And I think that that's a good thing. When kids get comfortable with you, they're more likely to disobey. Like that's why kids are worse for their parents than they often are for other people. It was a couple rough months, and I took some maternity leave, and I would be home with her like all day, and there were some difficult times, but also really beautiful times. And I think it was just like so surreal that this dream was coming true, this dream of adopting, that we had done it and we had followed through, and now we were experiencing the rewards of being able to have her in our home and have Brielle be part of our family. I will probably in the future do another video about just the difficult parts of adoption, because I do think it's really easy to watch videos about adoption stories, or to watch like those really cool like video montages of someone's adoption, and to just get this really inaccurate view of the struggles that come along with it. Because we adopted an 18-month-old, and we still saw that pain and that struggle that she went through adjusting. And a lot of people think that when they're that young, it doesn't really matter. They don't remember. They remember. And I think I would like to just share some of my experience of how I felt during that time and some of the behaviors that we saw, just so you can know what it's really like, because I think that's really important. You don't want to walk into adoption thinking it's going to be some fairy tale and be perfect, because it starts in brokenness, and there is going to be a difficult road ahead if you do choose adoption, but it's also a beautiful road ahead. I actually wrote a blog post about this recently, and you can read a little bit more about how adoption can, you know, start from brokenness but can end up being really beautiful. But I do want to share those difficult parts because I think it's important. To end up this story, we actually finalized our adoption on Halloween of this year. So we are officially a family, we are legally a family, and it's just so exciting to know that everything is done and finalized. We are planning on adopting again in the future. We do not know the timeline on that yet, but we know that that is the next step eventually. We're trying to figure out what we're supposed to do right now and what timing we should use on that. We just want to make sure that she is fully adjusted before we move on and start to try to adopt another child, and we want to make sure that she's ready for that transition as well. So that is our adoption journey. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope that it helped you in some way. Feel free to give it a thumbs up if you liked it, and I would love to hear from you in the comments. Are you thinking about adoption? What brought you to this video? Are you an adoptive family yourself? What has been your experience in your road? And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions. So thanks so much for watching my video, and just so you know, I post new videos every Thursday, so if you come back next week, you can catch my next video. Thanks, bye!